The convoy rolled through the narrow French road in the gray dawn of August 1944. 18 trucks laden with ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies stretching nearly 2 kilometers under camouflage netting. Oberleutnant Franz Weber sat in the lead vehicle, eyes scanning the hedgerows for signs of ambush, his fingers drumming nervously against the metal doorframe. Behind him, young conscripts, barely old enough to shave, gripped their rifles with white knuckles, their breath forming small clouds in the cool morning air. The silence felt oppressive, broken only by the grinding of gears and the rumble of diesel engines that seemed to announce their presence to every hidden enemy within kilometers. Weber had made this run 3 times before, each time returning with his convoy intact, but each time also hearing stories from other units that had not been so fortunate. The Americans were out there somewhere, watching, waiting, choosing their moment with the patience of hunters who knew their prey had nowhere else to go. No one spoke above a whisper, as if silence itself could shield them from what every German soldier now feared more than artillery or air raids. The sound came first, a rhythmic, mechanical clatter that seemed to materialize from nowhere and everywhere at once, like the beating of some terrible metal heart. Weber's stomach dropped before his mind could process what he was hearing. That distinctive, rapid-fire staccato that had become the soundtrack of 1,000 German nightmares. 600 rounds per minute poured from the tree line before anyone could shout a warning. Tracers carving bright lines through the morning mist as the lead truck exploded in a fountain of flame and shrapnel. The Americans had found them again. And once more it was that cursed machine gun, the one weapon that had transformed every supply run into a potential massacre, every retreat into a desperate sprint for survival. Franz never finished his order to disperse, the words dying in his throat as bullets punched through steel plating like paper, and men screamed in languages that all sounded the same when death arrived. The second truck swerved violently to avoid the burning wreckage of the first, careening into a ditch where its fuel tank ruptured, spilling gasoline that ignited seconds later when tracers found it. The third truck's driver, a boy from Hamburg who had celebrated his 18th birthday 2 weeks earlier, froze at the wheel, paralyzed by the sight of his comrades burning alive ahead of him. The hesitation cost him his life as armor-piercing rounds tore through the cab, turning the windshield into a spray of blood and glass. Weber threw himself from his vehicle, hitting the ground hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs, scrambling on hands and knees toward the shallow drainage ditch that ran alongside the road. Around him, the world had become a chaos of explosions, screaming metal, and human voices raised in terror and agony. The machine gun never stopped, its rhythm as steady and remorseless as a metronome, each burst finding another target, another truck, another cluster of men trying desperately to find cover where none existed. What made the Ma Deuce, as American soldiers affectionately called the Browning M2 heavy machine gun, such an overwhelming force was not merely its technical specifications, though those were formidable enough. It was the psychological weight it carried, the way its presence on a battlefield fundamentally altered German tactical calculations and shattered the confidence of units that had once considered themselves invincible. To understand why this single weapon became synonymous with convoy annihilation requires looking beyond barrel length and muzzle velocity into the realm of human terror and tactical desperation. The M2 had been born in the mind of John Moses Browning during the final days of World War I, when the American military recognized that existing machine guns lacked the range and penetration to engage aircraft and lightly armored vehicles effectively. By 1933, after years of refinement, the weapon emerged in its definitive form. A 50-caliber monster weighing 84 pounds without its tripod or mount, capable of hurling half-inch bullets at distances exceeding 2,000 meters with devastating accuracy. Each cartridge carried a projectile weighing between 600 and 700 grains, depending on type, moving at velocities approaching 900 meters per second. The kinetic energy delivered by these rounds was sufficient to penetrate 30 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor at 500 meters, punch through concrete walls, disable light vehicles with a single burst, and reduce human bodies to catastrophic trauma that field medics could barely comprehend. German soldiers who survived M2 attacks described wounds unlike anything they had encountered on the Eastern Front. Limbs severed cleanly as if by invisible blades, torsos opened by exit wounds the size of dinner plates. The medical reports from German field hospitals told stories that defied the normal vocabulary of combat injury. Doctors accustomed to treating bullet wounds from standard infantry weapons found themselves confronted with trauma that more closely resembled artillery fragments or industrial accidents. A single .50 caliber round striking a human torso could create a wound channel the width of a fist, the temporary cavity formed by hydrostatic shock literally tearing organs apart, even inches away from the bullet's actual path. Limbs struck by these projectiles often required amputation, not because bones were broken, but because the entire muscular and vascular structure had been destroyed beyond any hope of repair. But raw power alone does not explain the weapon's psychological dominance. What truly distinguished the M2 was its reliability under conditions that would render other weapons inoperable. Its ability to maintain sustained fire far longer than German equivalents, and the tactical flexibility that allowed American forces to deploy it in configurations that maximized its terrorizing effect on enemy morale. Where German machine guns like the MG42 offered higher rates of fire, they lacked the M2's range and penetration, and where German anti-tank weapons could defeat heavier armor, they could not sustain the volume of fire that made convoy interdiction so devastatingly effective. The German MG42, despite its fearsome reputation and nickname Hitler's buzzsaw, fired 8mm rounds at 1200 rounds per minute, but effective range rarely exceeded 1000 meters, and penetration was insufficient gegen even lightly armored vehicles. The weapon excelled in defensive positions where its high cyclic rate could sweep attacking infantry formations, but it lacked the reach and hitting power to dominate the kind of long-range ambush scenarios where the M2 thrived. Moreover, the MG42's barrel life was notoriously short under sustained fire, requiring changes every few hundred rounds during intense engagements, and the weapon was prone to jamming when dust or debris entered its action. The summer of 1944 brought the M2 into its full, terrible prominence as Allied forces broke out from Normandy and began their drive across France. German supply lines, already stretched thin and vulnerable to constant air attack, now faced a new threat that operated in the gray space between traditional infantry combat and anti-armor warfare. American reconnaissance units mounted M2 heavy machine guns on jeeps, half-tracks, and improvised gun trucks, creating highly mobile hunter-killer teams that could race along parallel roads, set up ambush positions with terrifying speed, and vanish before German reinforcements arrived. The tactical doctrine behind these mobile ambush teams represented a fundamental shift in how machine guns were employed on the battlefield. Traditional military thinking positioned heavy machine guns as defensive weapons, anchoring static positions and providing supporting fire for infantry attacks. The Americans inverted this logic, treating the M2 as an offensive weapon system capable of seeking out and destroying enemy formations in their most vulnerable moments. Reconnaissance elements would identify German convoy routes, calculate timing and movement patterns, then position M2-equipped vehicles at optimal ambush points where terrain and sight lines favored the attackers. Sergeant Karl Hoffmann, a logistics officer who survived 3 separate convoy attacks, later described the tactical nightmare in interviews that would haunt German military archives. His unit had been moving through Normandy's bocage country, where ancient hedgerows created a natural maze of high-walled corridors that limited visibility to mere meters. Standard doctrine called for infantry escorts and advanced scouts, but the Wehrmacht was so desperately short of men that most supply convoys rolled with minimal protection, gambling that speed and timing would see them through. The bocage terrain, which had seemed like such an advantage during the initial Allied invasion by channeling attacking forces into narrow killing zones, had now become a death trap for German logistics. The same earthen walls topped with dense vegetation that restricted movement also provided perfect concealment for ambush positions. An M2 team could set up behind a hedgerow with complete invisibility, wait for a convoy to enter the killing zone, then open fire at ranges where German return fire would be both ineffective and poorly aimed due to the shock of sudden attack. The Americans understood this desperation and exploited it with methodical precision. Rather than attacking every convoy, which would have been wasteful and predictable, they monitored German movements, identified patterns, and struck at moments of maximum vulnerability, often at dawn or dusk when visibility favored the attackers and German air support was grounded. The M2's extreme effective range meant that American gunners could open fire from positions well beyond the reach of return fire from truck-mounted weapons, and the penetration of 50-caliber rounds negated whatever light armor German vehicles possessed. Intelligence gathering for these ambush operations relied on a sophisticated network of French resistance fighters who observed German movements and radioed information to Allied units. An convoy preparing to depart from a supply depot would be observed by resistance members who noted the number and type of vehicles, estimated cargo, direction of travel, and approximate departure time. This information would be transmitted to American reconnaissance units, who would calculate likely routes, identify optimal ambush sites along those routes, and position their M2 teams accordingly. By the time the German convoy actually departed, its fate was often already sealed. Hoffmann recalled the sound most vividly, not the initial burst, but the sustained roar that seemed to go on forever, as tracers walked methodically down the length of his convoy, each truck erupting in sequence like dominoes made of gasoline and ammunition. The noise alone was psychologically devastating, a mechanical scream that drowned out orders and rational thought, leaving only animal panic as drivers tried to accelerate or brake, colliding with each other in clouds of dust and terror. In 40 seconds of sustained fire, the American position eliminated 11 of 14 trucks, killed 23 men, and wounded 40 more, then disappeared before Hoffmann's survivors could even identify where the shots had come from. The acoustic signature of the M2 firing was itself a weapon of psychological warfare. The deep, rhythmic booming of 50-caliber rounds being fired created a sound that carried for kilometers, announcing to every German soldier within earshot that somewhere, right now, men were dying under the guns. Veterans learned to distinguish the M2's firing pattern from other weapons by sound alone, and the recognition triggered immediate visceral fear responses. Even soldiers kilometers away from an actual engagement would experience elevated heart rates, sweating, and anxiety upon hearing that distinctive cadence echoing across the countryside. What made these attacks so effective was the M2's dual-role capability. The same weapon that could shred unarmored trucks with ball ammunition could be loaded with armor-piercing incendiary rounds that turned light vehicles into death traps and fuel carriers into rolling crematoriums. German convoy commanders faced an impossible calculation. If they spaced vehicles far apart to reduce casualties from area weapons, they lost mutual support and made individual trucks vulnerable to being cut off and destroyed piecemeal. But if they stayed close together for concentrated defense, a single well-positioned M2 could engage the entire convoy in one murderous sweep. The spacing dilemma created endless debates among German logistics officers trying to develop doctrine that would minimize losses. Spacing vehicles 50 meters apart meant that an ambush would initially engage only a small portion of the convoy, potentially allowing the majority to escape. But it also meant the convoys stretched over nearly a kilometer of road, making it impossible for escort vehicles to provide protection to the entire formation. Furthermore, communications between widely spaced vehicles was difficult, especially under fire, leading to situations where parts of the convoy would continue moving while other sections were being destroyed, inadvertently delivering themselves into the killing zone. Conversely, maintaining tight spacing of 15 to 20 meters between vehicles meant better communication and mutual support. But it also created a target-rich environment where a single machine gun position could engage multiple vehicles simultaneously. American gunners were trained to identify and prioritize specific vehicle types within convoys, typically opening fire on fuel trucks first to create chaos and block roads with burning wrecks, then systematically engaging ammunition carriers, command vehicles, and finally general cargo trucks. A well-executed ambush against a tightly spaced convoy could destroy or disable the entire formation in under 2 minutes. The ammunition types available to M2 gunners expanded their tactical options in ways that German planners found increasingly difficult to counter. Ball rounds for general-purpose use, armor-piercing for light vehicles, incendiary for fuel and ammunition carriers, tracer for fire adjustment, and armor-piercing incendiary tracer rounds that combined penetration with fire-starting capability. American gunners could mix their ammunition belts to create devastating cocktails tailored to specific targets, placing one AP round followed by 2 API rounds, then a tracer for observation, creating a pattern that maximized both penetration and fire damage. The complexity of ammunition selection required significant training and experience, but veteran M2 crews developed almost instinctive understanding of which ammunition types to use against different targets. A convoy of supply trucks carrying rations or equipment would receive primarily ball ammunition, which was sufficient to penetrate thin truck bodies and cause casualties among personnel. A convoy including fuel bowsers required heavy use of incendiary and API rounds to ensure ignition of spilled gasoline or diesel. Mixed convoys with armored cars or half-tracks demanded armor-piercing rounds capable of defeating 12 to 20 millimeters of steel plate. NAFTA action reports from France and Belgium repeatedly noted the speed with which American ambush teams could reposition between attacks. Unlike traditional machine gun emplacements that required extensive digging and fortification, Jeep-mounted M2s operated more like cavalry than artillery, appearing suddenly at a tactically advantageous point, unleashing hell for 2 or 3 minutes, then racing away before German forces could organize a response. This mobility multiplied the psychological effect because convoy crews could never feel safe even on roads they had traveled without incident hours earlier. The Jeep-mounted M2 configuration became particularly infamous among German logistics personnel. A standard Willys Jeep mounting a pedestal-mounted M2 could be set up for firing in under 30 seconds, engage targets at ranges up to 1,500 meters, then break down and depart in under a minute. The vehicle's small size and maneuverability allowed it to use farm tracks, forest paths, and other routes inaccessible to larger vehicles, giving American ambush teams the ability to approach and withdraw from attack positions without using main roads where German patrols might intercept them. The weapon's mechanical reliability proved equally demoralizing. German machine gunners knew from bitter experience that sustained fire caused overheating, jamming, and eventual barrel failure, requiring time-consuming repairs under combat conditions. The MG-42, for all its fearsome reputation, could not maintain truly continuous fire for more than a few minutes without risking damage. The M2, by contrast, could fire hundreds of rounds without significant degradation if properly maintained, and its quick-change barrel system allowed trained crews to swap barrels in seconds, maintaining fire almost indefinitely given sufficient ammunition. American doctrine emphasized this advantage through specialized gunnery training that taught crews to fire in precise bursts of 5 to 7 rounds, maximizing accuracy while managing heat buildup. German survivors consistently reported that M2 ambushes featured what seemed like impossibly long periods of sustained fire, wave after wave of heavy slugs that never seemed to stop even as German positions returned fire or attempted to maneuver. This created a cascading psychological effect where each passing second of incoming fire without cessation eroded morale and tactical cohesion until units simply broke and ran. The technical specifications that enabled this battlefield dominance were themselves products of obsessive engineering refinement. The M2's recoil-operated mechanism, perfected over decades of testing, distributed firing stresses across the weapon's frame in ways that minimized wear and maintained accuracy over tens of thousands of rounds. Its adjustable headspace and timing allowed armorers to fine-tune the weapon for optimal performance with different ammunition types and environmental conditions. German weapons designers, when they examined captured M2s, grudgingly acknowledged the sophistication of a design that appeared brutally simple but contained countless subtle innovations. One feature that particularly impressed German engineers was the M2's feed system, which could reliably cycle ammunition belts through the weapon even when mounted on moving vehicles traveling at high speeds over rough terrain. German machine guns typically required stable mounting and careful ammunition handling to avoid feed jams. But American gunners could engage targets while their jeeps bounced through fields or along bombed roads, maintaining fire through conditions that would render most weapons inoperable. This meant that convoy defense forces found themselves under accurate fire from moving attackers, who could shoot effectively while simultaneously repositioning, a combination that proved nearly impossible to counter. The feed mechanism's reliability stemmed from Browning's original design philosophy, which prioritized mechanical simplicity and robust construction over theoretical performance maximums. Where German weapons often incorporated complex systems that offered marginal performance advantages under ideal conditions but proved fragile in field use, the M2 featured generous tolerances and overbuilt components that absorbed abuse and continued functioning even when poorly maintained or operated by inexperienced crews. This engineering philosophy meant that even hastily trained American machine gunners could achieve effective fire, while German weapons often required extensive training and meticulous maintenance to reach their design potential. The psychological dimension of convoy vulnerability extended beyond the immediate terror of ambush to corrode the entire German logistics system. As summer turned to autumn in 1944, Wehrmacht quartermasters faced an increasingly impossible dilemma. The German army in France and Belgium needed constant resupply to maintain combat operations against Allied advances, but every supply run now carried the very real possibility of complete loss. Drivers began refusing assignments, claiming mechanical problems or sudden illness. Officers discovered that it took longer to assemble volunteer convoy crews than to complete the actual supply missions. This personnel crisis created a vicious cycle where the most experienced drivers either died in ambushes or found ways to avoid convoy duty, leaving supply operations to inexperienced recruits who lacked the tactical awareness to identify ambush sites or execute emergency procedures effectively. Military police reports from the period document a sharp increase in desertions and cases of self-inflicted wounds among logistics personnel, acts of desperation by men who saw convoy duty as a slow form of execution. The desertion problem became so severe that by late summer 1944, German logistics units in France operated under a system that resembled battlefield discipline more than normal rear echelon operations. Drivers were assigned armed guards whose nominal purpose was convoy defense, but whose actual role increasingly involved preventing German personnel from abandoning their vehicles or refusing to move. Summary executions for cowardice or desertion, rare in logistics units earlier in the war, became disturbingly common as commanders attempted to maintain operational capability through terror when leadership and morale had failed. The economic calculus of convoy warfare favored the Americans overwhelmingly. An M2 machine gun cost the United States approximately $2,000 to manufacture in 1944, including the weapon itself, mounting hardware, and spare parts. A single German supply truck fully loaded with ammunition, fuel, or equipment represented an investment of tens of thousands of dollars plus the irreplaceable value of its cargo and crew. One well-positioned M2 could destroy millions of dollars worth of German material in minutes while risking only a few $100s worth of ammunition and a small crew that could usually escape before counterattack. The ammunition expenditure for a typical convoy ambush was remarkably modest by military standards. An M2 crew might fire between 200 and 500 rounds during an engagement lasting 2 to 3 minutes, at a cost of roughly $1 per round for standard ball ammunition and slightly more for specialized types. This meant that destroying a 10-truck convoy carrying critical supplies worth hundreds of thousands of dollars cost the Americans perhaps $300 to $500 in ammunition, plus the operational costs of maintaining the ambush team and their vehicle, a return on investment that military planners could only dream about in conventional combat operations. German commanders understood this arithmetic and attempted various countermeasures, none of which proved consistently effective. Armored cars attached to convoys offered some protection, but were too few and too slow to prevent determined ambushes. The typical German armored car mounted either a 20mm cannon or a heavy machine gun, neither of which could match the M2's range or penetration, meaning that even armored escorts often found themselves unable to suppress American positions effectively before their convoy suffered catastrophic losses. Additionally, armored cars were desperately needed for frontline reconnaissance and combat operations, making their diversion to convoy escort duty a luxury the Wehrmacht could rarely afford. Aerial escort was sporadic at best given Allied air superiority and the Luftwaffe's collapse. By late summer 1944, the Luftwaffe in France possessed fewer than 200 operational aircraft of all types, facing an Allied force of more than 10,000 aircraft. German air units prioritized fighter missions attempting to contest Allied tactical air power, leaving virtually no resources for convoy escort or armed reconnaissance. The few occasions when German aircraft did attempt to provide convoy protection often ended disastrously, as Allied fighters prowling the skies would pounce on any Luftwaffe aircraft that revealed itself, leading to situations where German air cover actually attracted more attention than it prevented. Night movement reduced visibility for both sides, but also slowed convoy speeds and increased accident rates. German logistics units attempted to adopt primarily nocturnal movement schedules, gambling that darkness would provide concealment from both air attack and ground ambush. However, night driving without lights over war-damaged roads proved extraordinarily dangerous, leading to accidents that destroyed as many vehicles as enemy action. Convoys creeping along at 15 or 20 kilometers per hour to avoid accidents became easy targets for American teams equipped with infrared viewing equipment or simply willing to set up listening posts that would detect approaching convoys by engine noise and attack using tracer rounds to walk fire onto targets in the darkness. Route variation helped marginally, but the limited road network in France and Belgium meant that American intelligence could usually predict general movement corridors and position ambush teams accordingly. Convoys attempting to use secondary roads or cross-country routes often found these paths blocked by destroyed bridges, bomb craters, or terrain impassable to heavily loaded trucks, forcing them back onto main routes where ambush teams waited. The infrastructure destruction caused by Allied air attacks, intended primarily to interdict German supply lines, had the secondary effect of channeling whatever traffic remained onto predictable routes that made ambush planning remarkably straightforward. Some German units attempted to reverse the tables by setting their own ambushes, using fake convoys to draw American hunter-killer teams into killing zones. These operations occasionally succeeded, but required resources and coordination that the Wehrmacht increasingly lacked. Moreover, American reconnaissance was good enough that obvious traps were usually identified and avoided, while genuine convoys remained vulnerable.
Die für-deutschen Success-Stories, wo Convoy Defense Forces deströhrte angreifende Jeeps, offerten kalten Komfort gegen den ständigen Attrition von Supplies und Moral. Ein solch successvoller deutscher Counterambush occurrte im September 1944 näher der Town von Sedan, wo eine Wehrmacht-Security-Unit setzte eine Fake-Konvoi von Damaged Vehicles allang einer frequent attackierten Rotsektion, während positionierte Anti-Tank-Guns und Infanterie in Concealed-Positionen. Wenn ein amerikanischer M2-Team die Beet annahm und öffnete Feuer auf die stationäre Vehicles, German Forces reagierten mit koordiniertem Feuer, das den angreifenden Jeep und killte es Crew. However, dieses einzige Success requirierte 2 Tage Vorbereitung, die Diversion einer vollen Infanteriekompanie von Frontline-Duties und extense Reconnaissance, die den Ambush-Site als besonders vorteilhaftes Terrain.
The resources invested to achieve one tactical victory could not be sustained across the hundreds of kilometers of supply routes the Wehrmacht needed to defend. The cumulative effect of convoy losses on German combat effectiveness cannot be overstated. Panzer divisions in desperate need of fuel found themselves immobilized not because they lacked operational tanks, but because the gasoline trucks never arrived or arrived half-empty after dumping their loads to escape ambush. Artillery batteries rationed ammunition to a few shells per day, not from overall shortage, but because the supply chain between depots and front lines had become a bleeding wound. Medical units operated without adequate supplies because ambulance convoys faced the same predatory environment as ammunition haulers.
By late autumn 1944, German military intelligence estimated that between 20 and 30% of all supply convoys attempting to reach frontline units in France suffered significant losses to interdiction, with M2-equipped ambushes accounting for the majority of these incidents. The actual percentage was likely higher because many convoys never reported attacks where they successfully escaped, not wanting to draw attention to route compromises or admit to unauthorized route deviations. The psychological shadow of the M2 had become as effective a weapon as the physical destruction it inflicted. These statistics translated into tangible combat degradation across German formations. A panzer division nominally required approximately 400 tons of supplies daily to maintain full combat effectiveness, including fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts.
With 30% attrition in convoy operations, divisions received roughly 280 tons daily, forcing difficult prioritization decisions about which units would receive full allocation and which would operate on starvation rations. Invariably, the choices favored frontline combat units at the expense of support and service elements, creating a cascading failure as maintenance capabilities eroded, vehicles broke down without repair parts, and overall operational readiness declined. German soldiers at the front, already demoralized by retreats and casualties, began to view their own supply system as actively hostile rather than merely incompetent. When promised reinforcements and ammunition failed to arrive, troops increasingly assumed the worst, that somewhere behind the lines another convoy had been caught and slaughtered by American machine gunners. This erosion of confidence in basic logistics fundamentally undermined unit cohesion and combat effectiveness in ways that tactical victories could not repair. The nightmare quality of M2 convoy attacks stemmed partly from their sudden randomness. Unlike artillery barrages which built gradually with ranging shots, or air attacks preceded by engine noise, heavy machine gun ambushes exploded without warning from concealment ranges that made visual detection nearly impossible. One moment, a convoy would be rolling along a quiet road. The next moment, the lead vehicle would erupt in flames as tracers stitched through thin armor and flesh. The cognitive dissonance between perceived safety and sudden catastrophic violence created trauma responses in survivors that German military psychiatrists were ill-equipped to treat. Franz Weber, the officer who survived the August convoy attack, spent 3 weeks in a field hospital, being treated not for physical wounds, but for what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. He could not sleep without seeing tracers in the darkness behind his eyelids, could not hear vehicle engines without experiencing panic attacks. When he finally returned to duty, he found himself assigned to a desk position precisely because his superiors recognized that putting him back on convoy duty would be both cruel and tactically counterproductive. His case was far from unique. By late 1944, German logistics units showed casualty rates approaching those of frontline infantry, except that logistics casualties came not from sustained combat, but from brief, violent encounters that killed or traumatized entire crews in seconds. The technical advantages of the M2 were amplified by the training and doctrine that American forces developed around the weapon.
Unlike machine gun employment, which emphasized positional defense and interlocking fields of fire, American doctrine treated the M2 as an offensive weapon system capable of seeking out and destroying enemy formations. Special schools taught not just basic gunnery, but tactical employment, map reading to identify optimal ambush sites, vehicle recognition to prioritize targets, rapid emplacement and displacement procedures, and combined arms coordination with reconnaissance elements. This investment in training created a cadre of specialist heavy machine gunners who understood that their mission was not defensive fire support, but aggressive interdiction. They studied German convoy patterns, learned to recognize different vehicle types by silhouette and sound, practiced engagement procedures until they could set up and begin firing in under 60 seconds.
German intelligence estimates suggested that elite American machine gun teams could achieve hit rates exceeding 70% in ideal conditions, meaning that in a typical 15-vehicle convoy, 10 or more trucks could be hit before the formation could react or escape. The psychological advantage extended to American forces as well, creating a virtuous cycle of confidence and effectiveness. Machine gun crews knew they possessed a weapon that German forces genuinely feared, that the sound of their M2 opening fire could cause panic and rout even before significant casualties occurred. This knowledge bred boldness in tactical planning, willingness to engage targets that might have seemed risky with lesser weapons, and an aggressive mindset that German defenders found increasingly difficult to counter. What ultimately made the M2 the nightmare of German convoys was not any single factor, but the convergence of technical excellence, tactical innovation, and psychological dominance into a weapon system that transformed logistics warfare. Every German supply truck that burned, every driver who died screaming, every critical shipment that never reached its destination represented a small victory for a machine gun that had been designed decades earlier, yet proved perfectly suited to the mobile mechanized warfare of 1944 and beyond. As winter approached and German forces retreated eastward toward the Reich, the convoy nightmare followed them. American advance elements equipped with M2s harassed supply lines all the way to the Rhine, then across into Germany itself. The weapon that had terrorized French hedgerows proved equally effective in German towns and forests.
By war's end, German logistics officers estimated that M2-related losses had cost die Wehrmacht Hunderte von Tausenden Tons von kritischen Supplies, Tausende von Vehikeln und ungezahlte Lives, kreieren eine cascading failure in dem Supply-System, das contributed ausgenommen mehr zu German collapse als jede battlefield defeat. If this story of fear and firepower made you reconsider what truly decides wars, share your thoughts below and help keep these mechanical memories alive.